Hey guys, Chris here with theGoodOldGamer. So if you're watching this on the day of its release, and you're here in the United States, I want to wish all of you a happy Independence Day, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your holiday to come visit with me. Alrighty, so today we're going to be finishing it up. 2004 through 2019, the entirety of the mainstream CPU's IPC test. So this is a big one here. I wanted to get this out before Zen 2 came out, because, well, hey, that's just a few days away. So let's go ahead and see how all of these CPU architectures have compared over the past 15 years. Before we get to that, I do want to thank everybody who has supported this channel over the past year, especially all of our patrons who have helped me get all this tech on hands. This has been a long project. This has been going on for about a year now, and I want to thank all of you guys so much. I also want to thank Joe for helping me out with the Skylake benchmarks. That really has helped me out. And Breaking Dimes, I want to thank him once again for helping me solve my Ryzen IPC issues that we had, and for providing me with the Coffee Lake CPU benchmarks. Since he was already familiar with the process while helping me figure things out, it made sense to have him go ahead and do those benchmarks for me. So thank you to all of you guys and everybody out there who has liked, shared, and subscribed throughout this entire year. That has really helped me out in getting all this stuff. I'm really glad that we're able to go ahead and get this out to you. So with all that out of the way, I do want to go over some of the basics if you're unfamiliar with how this benchmark works. So starting things off, all CPUs were set to 3 gigahertz. Everything is set to 3, so this way it's a nice baseline. We're just testing architectures here. We're not testing overall performance. As far as RAM went, for DDR2, all of them were set to DDR2 800 megahertz at 44412 timings, and then DDR3 at 1600 with double the latency on the timings, and then DDR4, once again, double the frequency, but double the latency with the timings. This was done to go ahead and even things out as best as possible. Memory, bandwidth, and latency doesn't really affect these tests too much, so it didn't really have too much of an issue, but I wanted to have this be as balanced as possible. Alrighty guys, so with all that out of the way, let's start checking out those benchmarks. Alrighty guys, so we're going to kick things off with Cinebench R15. We can see here that the Coffee Lake CPU is actually coming in just a little bit behind the Skylake CPU. I found that a little bit interesting, but as we'll see throughout the benchmarks, these are basically going to line up relatively similar throughout. So this is just chalk that up to margin for error. And we can see that Zen and Zen Plus, the original Zen, is competing very well with Haswell, which is about where we were expecting that originally, and that's about where it's at, with Zen Plus coming up a few extra points, putting it within striking distance of Coffee Lake. So very, very close here on Cinebench R15. Moving on over to Blender, we can see kind of a similar result. We have Zen 1 coming in just a little bit ahead of Haswell, and then we can see Skylake and Coffee Lake relatively similar within margin of error, and then the Zen Plus architecture eking just a little bit closer, but Coffee and Skylake just edging it out by a little bit. Next up, we have CPU Z, and we can see here that we actually have an advantage from Zen to Haswell. So in this particular benchmark, the Zen architecture actually comes out a little bit ahead. And then we can see that Skylake and Coffee Lake actually does pull a little bit further ahead from the Skylake architecture. The only real difference is this CPU, this was a 9900K, and this was a 6700K. So they do have a different L3 cache amount, and that may be the reason why we see a little bit of difference here, but still within margin of error, not too far off. And then we have the Zen architecture right in between, with Zen Plus nipping at the heels of Coffee Lake. Now moving over to IDA64's integer test, the Queen benchmark, this is where we start to see the divide between AMD and Intel really become a little bit more pronounced. And I'll go into that here in a little bit, but we can see that Haswell, ironically enough, pulls ahead of both Skylake and Coffee Lake. Skylake is coming out a little bit ahead of Coffee Lake in this benchmark. Then we can see Zen and Zen Plus are lagging behind a pretty good bit on this particular benchmark, but they're not too far out. However, moving over to the IDA64 FP32 test, their FP32 ray tracing benchmark, this is where we see the biggest divide. We can see that Haswell is far behind that of Skylake and Coffee Lake in this particular test, and then we can see that Zen and Zen Plus are way behind on this particular test. Now, compared to the old pile driver and bulldozer cores, it's a significant upgrade, more than 2 times or about 2 times the performance on their older architecture, but they're still very far behind that of Intel on this particular test. Moving on over to the IDA64 latency test. Right here, the blue is L1 cache, orange is L2, yellow is L3, and the green, this is memory latency. So starting off, let's compare Coffee Lake to Skylake. As we can see, it's basically the same. Memory latency, nearly identical. L3 cache on Skylake is a little bit ahead of that of the Coffee Lake, likely due to the fact that this has more L3 cache. L2 cache, identical. L1 cache, the same. Now, from Haswell, we can see a pretty significant reduction in memory latency. So that's probably one of the areas that Intel gained a major advantage with Skylake and Coffee Lake over Haswell. And then also with the L3 cache, we can see going from 21 nanoseconds down to 14.9 or 18, that these are reduced even further, L2 and L1 in line with everything else. Now, compared to the Zen and Zen Plus, the original Zen is the furthest behind on memory latency. However, Zen Plus got pretty much within striking distance of Haswell. So this is a pretty big jump here from the first Zen to Zen Plus. Now, if we take a look at the L3 cache latencies, though, these are extremely good, competing with the best that Intel has to offer. Even the original Zen is just a little bit behind that of Skylake, and then L2 cache is a good bit behind. However, if we go to Zen Plus, the L3 cache is significantly ahead of any of the Intel chips, and its L2 cache is right in line. And of course, L1 cache is pretty much in line across the board here. Now, if we compare 15 years of CPU architecture, starting with 2004's Prescott core, all the way on up, we can see basically how they all stack up. We can take a look and see that Coffee Lake and Skylake basically are the same. So not using Kaby Lake for this test really isn't hurting us, because it would probably fall within this range here of just a couple percentage points and not really meaning anything significant. Now, if we compare the Zen and Zen Plus architectures, we can see that they are coming in behind that of Haswell. And like I said, I'll discuss that here in a sec, but it is a massive increase over its piledriver and bulldozer cores by over 2 times. So this is a significant jump from their older architecture and a really, really massive win. Now, if we switch on over and use Sandy Bridge as the baseline, we can see how everything compares. The old Prescott cores are 25% essentially of what Sandy Bridge offers, which is crazy when you think about it. But then we can see here that Haswell comes out about 26% ahead, and then Skylake jumping that up to about 43%. 43, 44, and then with Coffee Lake 45, 46. So these are basically the same. Like I said, Kaby Lake would probably slot in right in between. We're talking about margin of error differences there. Now we can see that Zen comes in at 18% higher, and then about 20% higher on Zen Plus. So this puts them pretty much right in line with Haswell. Now, I want to go back to the Prescott chart because we can see something pretty interesting here. So we can see here, that's 100%, that's our baseline. The K8 Athlon 64 CPUs were a massive difference, so much better back in 2004. They're basically twice as powerful for the exact same frequency, so that was really good. Now, if you notice, Conroe really wasn't that much better than the K8, and Wolfdale really wasn't that much better than Conroe, which also isn't that much stronger than the Athlon 64s, which came out before it. We can see that AMD on their Phenom 1 and Phenom 2 weren't able to get too much faster than the old K8 architecture. A little bit better, and it was in line with what Intel had to offer. Even the first generation Core series here, which I tested a Linfield CPU, isn't that much better than the K8. So these kind of just scaled up in like a stair-step pattern. Nothing super crazy, but back in the day, it still felt like it was a pretty good upgrade back then. And then we can see what happened with Sandy Bridge. This was a massive, an unbelievably massive increase in CPU IPC. And this is likely the reason why AMD couldn't compete. I don't think that they were expecting this massive jump. They were expecting maybe another stair step, maybe 75%, maybe right in over here or something. So they figured a little bit weaker IPC and a lot more cores, that would make some sense. So I'm thinking that was their thought process when coming out with the bulldozer and piledriver architectures, was they did not expect Intel to make such a massive leap that basically only AMD has ever really done before, going from Prescott all the way to their competing K8. It took Intel a few years later with Conroe to go ahead and match basically what AMD had done a few years earlier. But nope, Intel definitely took a massive lead here. And then if we take a look at Haswell, this is another sizable jump up here in performance. So Intel really wasn't sitting on their hands like we all thought that they were. Even though it was still 4 cores, 16 threads, I mean, the instructions per cycle did double with Haswell. So the technical IPC did go up considerably, and we can see what effect that actually had on things. And then once again with Skylake, we got another pretty significant jump from Intel. So AMD had to go basically from the same architectural level as their 2004 CPUs, the Athlon 64s. It's essentially where these are. I mean, it's a few percent higher, but not much, to competing to something that not only had one massive jump, but another sizable jump and another sizable jump on top of that. And with Zen and Zen Plus, they have done something really incredible. When you really think about having to go from here to here, that's a lot harder than going from here to here. I mean, this was crazy. Now, the reason why AMD's numbers are so much further behind than we would probably expect here is mostly due to the FP32 performance. This is a major win that Intel has right now. So for us as gamers, FP32 doesn't really make too much of a difference because FP32 is mostly going to be done on your GPU. So it's mostly integer calculations. And we can see here that AMD is right in line with Intel on this. They're a little bit behind, but not too much. However, this just goes to show that the IDA64 benchmark obviously does favor the Intel CPUs a little bit. And this does kind of counterbalance Intel's argument that Cinebench favors AMD CPUs. So overall, I think that this is a pretty fair and reasonably representative benchmark to show basically each CPU architecture in what they're good at and then what they're not so good at, or less good at, I suppose we could say. Overall, in actual applications, we can see that Zen Plus really isn't too far behind something like Coffee Lake and Skylake, and sometimes even beating it. But then we can also see in other specific applications, Intel does hold a significant advantage at this point in time. So ultimately, it'll just come down to what programs you're running. But at the end of the day, AMD has done something pretty amazing with their Zen CPUs, and we can definitively say that Skylake through Coffee Lake, there really hasn't been any changes of note. Well, alrighty guys, there you go. 15 years worth of mainstream CPU IPC right there in front of you. And honestly, the big takeaway for me was the Athlon 64 through pretty much the first generation Core series, there really wasn't that big of a difference when you really look at it in perspective like that. Obviously, the Pentium 4's IPC was really rough, but everything else there for a long time was so stagnant. And then we saw a massive increase there with Sandy Bridge. It's crazy when you see it all put together like that. And that's the reason why I wanted to do this test. Not so much to be like, oh, this is faster and this is faster, but to really see where the major progression came from and which architectures really did that. It's also really interesting to see that Haswell had a pretty good bump over Sandy Bridge, and then Skylake, yet again, another pretty sizable bump over Sandy Bridge. So, I mean, we've gotten some pretty good CPUs here in the past few years. It just didn't seem like that because we were stuck on 4 cores for pretty much ever. But nowadays, that's not really an issue. Ever since Ryzen came out and pretty much said, nope, we're going with maximum amount of cores with really solid IPC. This is kind of what it looked like they wanted to do with their bulldozer architecture. It just didn't work out the way that they wanted it to. And this time with Ryzen, they're doing really well. Now, of course, there are a few caveats with that and a few weaknesses that AMD still needs to iron out. We do know that Zen 2, this was talked about a lot by Lisa Su. I believe it was at CES this year when they were talking about the Zen 2 architecture. But FP32 performance was one of the main things that they were wanting to address with this architecture, as well as memory latency and pretty much all of the weaknesses that the current Zen and Zen Plus have. Zen 2 should address most, if not all of those. So it's going to be really exciting to see how Zen 2 compares to everything else. If it's going to bring AMD right up to par with Intel, greater than or equal to, or if it might actually be substantially better in certain areas. So I'm really interested to see that here in the not too distant future. So things are looking good. CPUs aren't as stagnant as we all thought. That's also a good thing to know, but it's great to see that things are really starting to take off on the CPU front because we needed more cores. I mean, 4 cores just wasn't cutting it 2015, 2016 anymore. But I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this. This is pretty interesting stuff. I want to hear your guys' take on this. Did you really think that Haswell and Skylake were that big of a jump? And how crazy it is that AMD had to basically make 3 big jumps up with their Zen architecture, and they did a really fantastic job of that. That's pretty nuts when you really put that in perspective. And if you guys like this video, please hit that like button, please subscribe, please share with friends. That really does help me out. And if you want to help support the channel for as little as $1 a month, you can become a patron. That really does help support the channel and get this stuff on hands. Also, for anybody out there interested in these charts, they will be available to everybody on my Patreon account, so you can download them for yourself if you want to look into any of this. And for everybody out there that does help support the channel on Patreon, you will get my Excel file for all of the IPC tests once I get Zen 2 complete. So that'll give you access to all my data so you can compare your numbers directly to those. So that's an extra benefit to all of you guys out there that have helped support me and make this happen. Well, alrighty guys, that's all I have for today, and I will catch you guys in the next video.